I just want to thank you for this morning, and thank you for another opportunity, Lord, to open up your word. Pray, Lord, that you would cleanse us from all unrighteousness, fill us with your Holy Spirit, help us to understand the words that we read in your book, and help us to not only understand these things now, but help us to be able to remember them and to be able to go back and study further, Lord. And may these impressions be left in our hearts so that it would transform our lives and that we would live according to what it is you teach us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Yesterday, we drew a table on the board to show the parallels between the visions in the book of Daniel. We looked at Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Daniel 11. And the main purpose for doing that was to show the consistency through those chapters that the statue in Daniel 2 represents what I'm calling the kingdoms of Satan, or the kingdoms of this world. And when you line up that with the other chapters, chapter 7, chapter 8, and into chapter 11, you see that all of those chapters teach this sequence of events, or this pattern. First you see the activities of the enemy. You see what Satan's kingdom and his representatives are doing. Then you see how God is going to respond to that. And the reason we looked at that is because of the discussion on the clay in Daniel 2, whether or not it's the term or the phrase potter's clay is good or bad. To me, the primary argument that says that it's not is based upon the other chapters in the book of Daniel, where you see this relationship between the papacy and pagan Rome, and depending on what chapter you go to, it uses different imagery, but they're all telling the same story. So that's the primary argument for me that says that the clay in Daniel 2 is not good.
In addition to your argument is Revelation 17, because it's the last mention of the kingdoms in the Bible, and we don't see a pure church in Revelation 17.
Yes. Revelation 17 tells us the same information. So we went yesterday to Daniel chapter 8, verse 12. And the reason why I went to Daniel 8:12. So can someone read Daniel 8:12?
Daniel 8, verse 12 reads as follows. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered.
So one of the arguments that I use when talking about the papacy is that the papacy is a church. It's a real Christian church. And people don't seem to see it that way. They seem to have this idea that in some shape or form the papacy isn't a church. People use the imagery that it's paganism dressed up as a church, but they want to give this picture that it's not actually a real church. My response to that is, if it wasn't a real church, then it wouldn't receive the punishment that it's receiving, because it wouldn't be doing anything wrong. So I think we've discussed this in class, but you're probably already familiar with it. When you go to the statue, you see that when you go right from the head down to the legs, that the materials they're just a single material. So the head just contains gold, and you go all the way down through the legs. Now you know that if you bring up Revelation 17, and even if you don't, even if you just went to history, that each of those empires have their own religion, and they're all pagan religions. So, for me, if you were to bring Revelation 17 into Daniel 2, you'd see this religion running all the way through the statue. So I think that's straightforward. Everybody sees that. But when you see it in the head, because it's a pagan religion, there's no controversy going on. There's no transgression. There's no problems, because those two entities, the government and the religion, are one in purpose and mind. They both represent the same thing. But when you get to the feet and the toes, now you get the introduction of clay. And my understanding of that is that God is trying to show us not so much who the people are that's being represented, whether it's God's church, ancient Israel, or modern Israel, or Protestantism, or Catholicism. It's trying to show us that whatever that religion that's been introduced now is a representation of God or his people. So that confuses people, hence they want to identify potter's clay as being different from miry clay, and they want to see that somehow or another we're talking about God's people. And my response is that it's not so much dealing with the fact that we can see God's people in that statue, but we can see a church. And so we went to verse 12 because it highlights this point in Daniel 8:12, that there's some transgression going on. We're all familiar with the concept of the image of the beast. All of these symbols or pictures are showing us that you have a church and the state that are in a relationship with one another, which is illegal. And what makes that relationship illegal? Why is it wrong?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Why is the relationship between the church and the state wrong? Why is it in transgression? Who is in transgression? I want to deal with some issues in verse 12 that we picked up yesterday. But just the whole principle of what's going on in verse 12, this transgression, and this is not the only place we see it.
I'm going to say, how did Jeff had don't know if it's a definition, but he mentioned that church and state has been functioning with Moses and Aaron. What A was a theocracy, and B, Moses the judge was, the state or the civil power was above the church, and it was parallel to how the man is the head of the woman type of thing. So he was kind of linking that, and I think he said something along the lines of it's because it's the church that is in control of the relationship.
So, any other thoughts?
I was thinking the combination of church and state is not bad, in the sense that God has a church and a state in heaven. He has a mount and a throne. If you go to just Isaiah 14, and Satan wants to sit on his throne, and he wants to place himself on the mountain. So there is a church relationship in God, and that's a good one, I guess, and all the others are a false one.
I think that there's no condemnation for people who are outside of God's church or God's people to be combined, church and state. For instance, Babylon, Medo Greece, and Rome were all church and state. Paganism was mixed with the state, and there was no problem. They're all pure golds, pure metals. But when you get to the feet of iron and clay, you have an apostatized group of people who profess Christianity, which makes it a problem. Christianity does not mix with the government of the world. This is the issue.
So the simplest way I understand it is that this church is married to Christ. It's all about the symbology of the marriage. And if you're married to Christ, then when you get into a relationship with the world or a king or a state, that you're committing adultery. And that's how I explain it. I think that's in agreement with what everybody has just said now. So when we go to verse... so if we understand that these are parallel passages, Daniel 8:12 and the iron and the clay, then when we look at the clay in Daniel 2, I'm not trying to argue that it's not representative of God's people. But what I am saying, it's not God's people in the sense of a pure church or a bad church. It's just dealing with the issue that it's a church. That's the point I want to bring up in Daniel 2. I'm not trying to see a transition. I'm not trying to see, when people use the term miry clay, that it's something dirty, or potter's clay, something clean. I'm just seeing it as church. There's a church there, and when it's in a relationship with the world, with iron, it's mixing with this iron, it's in transgression, it's doing something wrong. So however you look at the clay in Daniel 2, it's in a position or a condition that is not correct, that is not right. And I see that in Daniel 8 verse 12. It says, a host was given him, or we're going to say her, against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. So yesterday when we looked at this, we got tied up a bit because we got distracted, and I didn't realise there was anything to discuss on this verse besides the point I was trying to bring up, but there seemed to have been. So I looked in the book of Daniel at all the places where this word comes up. It's H5921. So the word is in Daniel 8 verse 12 when it says against, this word against. So I don't know if anybody else had a look or anybody has got any thoughts on what we spoke about yesterday. No? Okay. So it comes up in 45 verses. It's an extremely common word. I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 times in the Bible. It's everywhere this word is. And I started going systematically through every single verse that I could find in the book of Daniel, but I just ran out of time because there are so many. So what's the argument, or what's the position on this word against that caused a bit of I don't know, not a disagreement. The two views. What are we saying that this word against is going to bring to us? He's trying to show us. Sorry?
On top of and from.
So okay, so that was the main issue. We were saying it was on top of. Okay. So we're saying on top or from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What was the Strong's number again?
5921. And I struggle to find. I think there's one or two places where you can where the word from fits in nicely, but I struggle to find very many places where you could put it. So the first usage of this word in the book of Daniel is found in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. So if we're going to pick up on the principle of first use, then we'd go to Daniel 1, verse 1. And I think pretty much this gives us the definition of this word, almost exclusively through the whole of the book of Daniel. So can someone read Daniel 1 verse 1?
In the third year of the reign of the king of Judah came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it.
So when it says this word besiege in the English, it's actually a composite of two Hebrew words. And if you've got your computer there, you'll see that it means to bind or besiege or confine or to restrain. And then it means, then you get 5291, upon or on top of. So this word besieged means to be on top of something or against something whilst you're restraining it. So right from the beginning, it for me, it seems to have this connotation of something that is in opposition to another party. There's two elements that are in opposition to one another. So that's the primary definition that I think I see in here, that it's against. But it becomes a bit more sophisticated when we go down to verse 8, Daniel chapter 1 verse 8. Before we read that, the reason why we're looking at this is because I went from lining up these visions in Daniel 2, I'm saying that clay is a representation of a church. I'm not arguing. I did argue from the very word definition. When you look at all the grammar and you do a word study, you can demonstrate that it's a corrupt church. You can do that very easily. Some people found that a bit complicated, but from the wording of the vision, the structure of it, you can see it's mixing with state, and that mixing of state means that this church is in transgression by its very definition. Whatever the adjectives or the descriptions of what kind of a clay that is. Then we went to 8:12 to show that 8:12 is showing this same church-state relationship. And then we got sidetracked into 12 just to look at the history of it, because the word against, when I explained it, I was saying one thing and some people had a different understanding. So I just want to see if we can get some common understanding of how this word is used in the book of Daniel. So in chapter 1 verse 8. I don't know who was next to read.
But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself.
So the word in, it says what Daniel purposed in his heart, is the same word. So how do we understand that? He purposed from his heart. Against. So I want to pick up this idea that Daniel has placed something upon his heart. He's placed something upon his heart. He's got a desire, he's got a wish, he's got a dream, he's got a purpose, and he's placed this purpose upon his heart. And I think that fits with that's a correct interpretation of what that's saying. He has this desire, and this desire has been placed upon his heart. So he wants to do what's right. We could drop down to verse 11. Verse 11, it says, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So this word over is the same word. It's on top of, in charge of. So I think it's just a good exercise just to teach us, if we're not familiar with it, that when we get a particular word and we use it in a very forceful and strong way in a particular passage, sometimes it can have a totally different meaning when it's used elsewhere. And sometimes we don't see that. And I think that's probably what's happened when we've gone into verse 12. Because here, when it says has set charge over Daniel, there's no connotation, there's no negative connotation. He's not against him, he's not struggling against him, but it doesn't mean from. So from would not work in that. But when it says he's set over, it means he's in charge of somebody. So you can see how you can use this single word and have all its different nuances, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but always with the same thought or same concept. Verse 21 is another interesting, verse 20. Daniel chapter 1, verse 20. If we have a quick look at that. All I'm showing you as we go through is that when we see this use, it's very rare that it becomes the word from. So, 120. Who's reading next?
And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm.
So that phrase in the English where it says better than, better than is the same word. So how do we say that? Sorry? Someone said something? Above them. Yeah? Above. He's above them. He's over them. This one troubled me a bit. Daniel 2 verse 1. How are we going to do Daniel 2 verse 1? Someone read Daniel 2 verse 1.
And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him.
So the word from is the same word. So how do we understand the last part of this phrase when it says, and his sleep brake from him?
He lost sleep.
That's how I've always understand that phrase. That I thought it says his spirit was troubled, and he woke up. Basically, he couldn't sleep any longer. I've understood that his sleep was broken from him. But if you look at the Hebrew words, I don't think it says that. That word that we look at the word break. Some people have got their computers up. The word break means what?
To exist.
It means to exist. It means to come to pass. So it's. I think it's different that what's being taught here. And what I think this is saying, let me give you my definition. He was troubled by his dream. So that's the first bit. That's we're not arguing that. And it came to pass that his sleep was against him. I think what's being brought to view here, he realizes when he has his dream that there's some trouble going on. And when he wakes up, he doesn't remember the dream. We know that. But he has a realization that this dream is actually against him. There's something going on in this dream that's against him. And when you read the story of Daniel 2, why is he so irate against the astrologers? Why is he getting so angry with them?
Because they couldn't tell him what he drank.
I don't think that's the reason. It's not because they couldn't tell him. There's something a bit more subtle in the thing. I'd go to the passage, but I can't remember. I don't think I can directly go to the verses.
He said that when he was asking, nobody could give it to him, that he was asking something impossible.
I think that's what Brother Koleth is saying, but I think there's a bit more to it. Let me see if I can find it.
He says he felt like they were liars, that they were
He did not
deceiving.
trust him.
Okay, so he thinks that they're liars or deceiving, but if you can find the verse, it says, till the time pass. There's something it says something that the time passes.
Oh, yeah.
Which verse is that?
Verse 9?
Verse 8. So it's something in verse 8. It might just be verse 8.
Gain the time. Certainly that you would gain the time because you see.
Yeah, so let's read verse 8.
The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time because you see that the thing is gone from you.
Okay, so what time are they gaining?
A year?
Probationary time.
What if we're saying that when it says his sleep break from him means that his sleep was against him, whatever that dream was about, it was something that was going to do him harm.
Okay.
So he knows that he's got this dream that's doing him some harm. And now he's saying, the reason you're not telling me what's happening is because you want to gain the time. No?
You don't want to die.
So no, I think what he's saying is this: you know what that dream means. His position to start off with, he says, you know what my dream means, and you know that this dream is against me, and I know the dream is against me. So I want you to tell me what this dream is about that's against me. And they're saying, we're not going to tell you what this dream means. And he says, the reason you're not going to tell me what the dream means is because you're going to wait till the dream comes to pass. So you want to gain the time, you want to delay things, you don't want to tell me so I can make a preparation. And so when that dream comes to pass, then you're going to benefit from this in some way. So that's why he's so angry with him. It's not because they can't answer the dream, I don't think. I think it's because he sees that they understand the dream and they're going to use this information against him, hence gaining the time. That's, I think, why he's so angry.
When you read the Spirit of Prophecy, though, she speaks to the motives of the king and his thought process, and she doesn't say that he thought that they knew, that he perceived that they were deceivers. He was like, you guys don't know anything. You couldn't tell me even if you wanted to, because you really have no connection with the gods.
Yes.
So those seem kind of opposite to me.
I think they're complementary. I'm not arguing. I think what I'm saying isn't in opposition to what she says. But when he talks about gaining the time, I'm reading that gaining the time when we understand that his sleep break from him, that he hasn't stopped sleeping now. He knows that sleep was against him. So Daniel 8:2, just another usage of this word. And I saw in the vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was by the river Ulai. So that word by is the same word. So you know you couldn't put from in there. It's by, it means, you'd say you're over against something. You know, if you were going to meet somebody, you'd say, oh, I'll meet you over by that place. So it's the same way, he's by the river, he's over against the river, he's next to it, it means. That's what that phrase is saying. That was Daniel 8:2. Then you can go, there are many, many other places. If we just go to, let's go to Daniel 11. Sorry?
Could it be above?
I don't think it's above, because above would place him on the water. And I think that's where you're going to find Christ. Christ is above the water, is on the water. But all those little nuances of the word gives you the ability to see that he's by or next to something. There are other verses that show you the same thing, and in those cases it definitely means that. So can someone read Daniel 11 verse 24? The reason why we're going back to this is because I think Sister Bromley said, what about verse 25 yesterday? And for some reason we didn't read verse 25, and I wasn't sure what she meant, if it was in agreement or in disagreement. So we're going to read verse 24 and verse 25.
24. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time.
Then verse 25.
And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him.
So the last phrase in verse 25 is virtually the same phrase in verse 24. It says, for they shall forecast devices against him. And the history of this verse is not talking about from him. When in verse 25, for they shall forecast devices from him, I don't think it would work that way. That word against is on top of, in opposition to. And you see the same at the beginning of the verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south, in opposition to the king of the south, on top of him. And so in verse 24, it's that same usage. He shall forecast his devices on top of the strongholds. So I don't know if we could go for a lot more verses, but I hope that's enough to show us that the way that word is used, just in the book of Daniel, it doesn't mean from, it means on top of, in opposition, in charge of. With this idea of these two people who are in a fight, they're wrestling one another, and someone is on top of, and you would, yeah. Oh, go ahead. No.
So then verse 24 would read, forecast his devices while he's in dominance or in control of the strongholds, even for a time. So he's in control of the strongholds, even for a time. And then the next verse would be the king of the south, will come in opposition to him. At the end of verse 25 it would say that they shall antagonistically fight against.
Yeah.
So the word has, it's subtly different, but it still has the same connotation of dominance or in control.
And that's what I wanted to show, that when you take this this singular word, and this isn't the only time, it happens in so many Hebrew words, they all have this a singular word can have subtle differences depending on how you're going to use it. So it can mean something positive, it can mean something negative. In verse 24, it means he's standing on his ramparts. You know, he's got a fortress, he's got a castle, and he's standing there, and when he's standing there, he's going to rule the world. But in the very next verse, the same word is used subtly differently, but when you take its definition that means on top of, it still fits with that. So then we went to 8:12. So to me, I hadn't got bogged down in the history of it. All I wanted to show us that was that this host that's brought in 8:12. So we'll read 8:12. Then who's next?
And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered.
So Sister Tanya pointed out yesterday that the word him is a supplied word. It shouldn't be there. We know that the verb usage in verse 12 is a feminine verb. When you pick up all of those things, and you actually only see it in the last part of the verse where it says it cast down the truth to the ground, it practiced and prospered. Those two it's in the English are showing you that in the Hebrew this is the feminine verb phrase, and that's what we do with those 4 verses. We pick up the verb phrase. So it's talking about the papacy, and the only point that I was picking up is that it's in transgression. And then I think I just inadvertently just gave some history to go with that, and that's why we came to this discussion. So the word against there, I don't think it means from. If we're going to use it consistently, it means on top of, or as it's really used here, against. So there's some struggle going on between the host and the daily. They're in opposition one to another. So that's when I suggested that the host that's being spoken of here is Clovis. The Clovis is given to the papacy in order to make war or to be on top of the daily. And so when if that's the correct understanding of that verse, then I'm understanding in the same way that I would understand Daniel 12 verse 11.
Could it be both though? Could we use from if it fit better?
I guess I'm approaching it the other way around. I wanted to try and have used words as they're given to us, not try and dovetail the view that I might have or the history that I want to dovetail into a verse. I think you get into problems if you do that, because it's...
Is from in the definition itself. Where did it come from? The from?
It's,
Oh, how did we use them? You can see it partly in the definition, but the reason it was done that way, I think, is from 11:24, where it says he forecast his devices against the strongholds. And I think Uriah Smith says, in no uncertain terms, that it's from. He's going to do it from his, and then it's very easy to pick up, say that word now means from. Then you transfer it into 8:12, and you retain its fromness.
the way that he explained it yesterday too is the way that when you look at Strong's and it's broken down, you have the definition, and then you have the way that the writers of the translators of the King James chose to use that definition to put it into an English word, right? So what happens is from doesn't always mean, if you can take the word from and make it to mean something different in verse 8:12 than being on top of, because from in the sense of coming off of or from in a dominant position, you can use it that way according to the definition, or you can take that word from and isolate it away from the actual definition of the Hebrew word and use that word to say something completely different than what the definition of the actual word says. So you're redefining the word that's actually being used if you use it to say like out of or from that power. It's a subtle difference, but you're changing the definition of the word.
So it should be forecasted devices on top of the strongholds, even for a time.
Yeah, let me read the definition that's given in Strong. I said this yesterday, but maybe people didn't pick this up because maybe I rushed through this. Is that when you get, if you look at Strong's, depending on what kind of version you're looking at, depending on your computer program, but they all follow a similar sequence. So my Strong says properly the same as H5920. It says used as a preposition in the singular or plural, often with prefix or as conjunction with a participle following. And then it's going to give the definition. So it gives you 5921. And then it's going to give some grammar definition. It doesn't always do that, depending on the word. So it tells you that it's a preposition, and a preposition is a word that you just put in front of another word. It gives you some additional information. It helps you to gain some further insight into the noun that you're going to attach it to. So that's where we get prefix. So it's some word that you put in front of another word. And then it's going to give a definition, and it's going to give a number of definitions because it has a broad meaning. Then it has a colon with a dash on it. And I think in the printed version it's pretty consistent that way as well. And then it's going to have a list of all the words. So these are the words in the King James Version. So this is how they translated this word. And if you went into this word, depending on what Bible program you've got, but if you downloaded eSword, you can go into one of the modules. It's called King James Concordance, and it tells you every single word that in the English, in the King James, that it's used. So, for instance, it's got against, over, on, therefore, because, concerning, at, of. It has many, many different English words. But all of these words, they're not the definition. And we have to be careful when we do any kind of analysis, even most time it's basic, that we don't try and define this word here by these ones. This is not a definition. This is the definition here.
So you're saying that's what Uriah Smith did? Because he uses from.
Yeah. In the verse, it gives you the same answer. It doesn't do any despite to the verse when you use it as from. And in a number of other places, you could put from in there and it wouldn't make much difference. But if you use from in 8:12, it obviously changes how we're going to read that verse. Now, I don't know if it makes any serious material difference of how we interpret that verse. But I think I speak to somebody. They said if you have a little variation at the beginning, somewhere along the road, it opens up into a bigger thing. So all I'm just trying to show is my reasoning why I think verse 12 isn't from, and you can see that from the word, and if it isn't from, then I don't know if it changes. It definitely changes what's going on. It may not even change the history, because if we're going to say a host, someone was given from these pagan nations. That's one way of viewing this verse, but I don't think that the word sustains that. So if you came to the conclusion that it's Clovis that's been given to the papacy and he's one of the 10 horns, then that works fine. But I think the verse says Clovis is given to the papacy in order to fight against the daily. And that's why I said that I think it's a parallel passage to Daniel 12:11, where it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." So in Daniel 12:11, the way I understand that history, it picks up you've got the same daily, but now I understand it's from the phrase "take away." So there's two takeaways in the book of Daniel. Depending on the verse, it has a different connotation. And this takeaway here means, the way I often explain it is that if you had something on a table, and one of them was a dollar bill, and the other one was a piece of paper or tissue, which was being used, that if it's placed on a table and you were asked to clear that table away, you'd take away everything that's off that table. So wherever the word is used as take away in the book of Daniel is correct, it's translated correctly, take away. But it's again this issue of what the subtle differences between it. And you know as well as I do that if you had a dustbin here, and here you are, and you've got, just say you've got a handbag, it's a sister, that if you took everything away, you'd know what to do with these two things. The used tissue, you know that you'd throw it into the dustbin, but the dollar bill you wouldn't. You're taking away, but you do different things when you take those two things away.
When you destroy and when you
Store away.
Yeah, because it's precious, it has some value to it. And this causes problems when people get into verse 11 of Daniel chapter 8. They don't see this distinction between the two taking aways. So the takeaway that's in Daniel 12:11 is this one. This is Daniel 12:11. Sir, however we're going to pronounce that Hebrew word. It's a disposing of something. And this is the taking away of Daniel 8:11. So there's subtle differences, sir. Did you say something? Lifted up, yeah. So we use the term lifted up and exalted, which works fine. But what I'm suggesting is at its base, when you see what it actually means to take something away. And if we can understand it at that level, then we can add some embellishment to it. We can make it exalted. We can lift it up. We can understand something about it. But at its base level, they both mean the same thing. They both mean to take away. But because they have different values, then you deal with them differently. And I think you spoke in one. I just spoke in a previous class. It's to do with the sacrifices in Daniel 8:11 that you see this difference. When you go to Leviticus, I think it's chapter 4 to chapter 6, you see this difference of how you deal with a sacrifice depending on its body parts. Some body parts you sir, and some body parts you rum. And so this very quickly from this takeaway becomes an offering.
This is reminding me of when I first came onto this message. It was over the daily controversy, and I remember a guy telling me that he was using the rule of first mention, and they were saying that Daily is first mentioned as God's ministration, and they were using that as a proof that the daily is Christ's ministration in heaven. So, how do we reconcile that?
Where did they, without knowing the verses, or whatever, I wouldn't know how you do that.
You reconcile it by saying they're wrong.
I was going to say that, but...
The daily in the book of Daniel is not the same Hebrew word as it is in the rest of the scriptures. So the daily in the book of Daniel finds its first mention in the book of Daniel.
Okay.
Of course, yeah. Let me explain what that means. The daily or tamid is 104 times in the Bible, and we split 99 and 5 times the Bible and the book of Daniel, 65 books. Everywhere that you see this word here, everywhere, it's either an adverb or an adjective. And only in the book of Daniel is it a noun or a substantive. And so, what Elder Jeff is saying, it's the same word, but the way it's used in the book of Daniel, it stands on its own without any... it doesn't modify something, because as soon as you say daily sacrifice, so if you say daily sacrifice, this is the noun, and this becomes an adjective. And as soon as you take this away, this becomes a noun. And that's why William Miller, when we're getting to the study of the daily, when William Miller says, when I came across this word, I found it nowhere else in the Bible. That word is in the Bible 104 times. It's everywhere, but its usage is different. So if you're going to go to first usage, then the first time you're going to see it is used this way is in the book of Daniel, and it's used consistently. In fact, when it says daily sacrifice, and it's the only place that you'll see this phrase sacrifice in its applied term as well. It's never there are always real words in all the other 99 places. It's only daily sacrifice as a applied word in the book of Daniel, nowhere else. So, coming back to verse...
Can I ask you a question about takeaway that you may or may not know? And the false teaching on the daily claims that the understanding of Christ's sanctuary ministry was taken away from the minds of men with the introduction of the Mass. Okay? So that false argument says that the daily is taken away from the minds of men. And I heard once, and maybe you don't know, that where this "sir" is found in the Bible, it only addresses a literal taking away and never a metaphorical taking away. It's never used in the sense that it takes something away from your mind metaphorically, but only physical things. Have you ever checked that out?
No, I haven't seen that. I haven't heard that argument.
Okay, never mind.
So maybe someone could do that. Maybe I'll do that. The word "sir" is literal in its usage in the Bible. When you use the word "sir" as a takeaway, it's not figurative or symbolic or metaphorical. It's literal. So maybe we can. That will be an additional proof. I got the history in chapter 8, verse 12, from the last part of the verse. Something happens in the first part of the verse, and then it casts down the truth to the ground, and it practices and prospers. So I've understood that as when it rises to the ascendancy, 538. So verse 12 is some kind of, it's obviously before that, but that, however way you'd understand that verse, it would be for it. But I'm seeing a cause and effect relationship here, and that's why I've understood it to mean that Clovis was given to the papacy to fight against the Visigoths in 508, breaking the back of paganism, and once it does that, then it will practice and prosper. Sister Bromley.
You mentioned yesterday that you label the daily and Daniel different chronologies for each daily. Are you going to go through and list out those 5? You know, obviously you've done now verse 12 is 508 to 538. Are we going to go through and do all of them and how you label them by date?
We could do. I wouldn't mind doing that, but then if people would see it as germane to where we're going, because I think it's an interesting thought in and of itself. Although I think in one of the studies when I was away, one of the classes, it did come up.
But you have notes on it?
It was
just
responsible. I don't have notes on it, unfortunately, because I always talk
Okay.
to people about it.
Okay.
So this is why you're saying it's a parallel to verse 11 of chapter 12, because you're saying that the daily is taken away, and then the abomination that maketh desolate is set up to practice and prosper. So it's 2 parts, just like this is 2 parts. This is speaking to the setting up of the papacy, that progressive setting up of that kingdom.
Yeah.
Verse 12 is the same as verse 11 in chapter 12. Okay.
A class, before you went down south, you were assigning the removal of the daily to just hanging on Clovis, and now you're putting the weight on Clovis. Did I mishear you before?
I'm inclined to follow through with Sister Bronwyn's request that if we look through the daily, in each of those 5 places, that it might be profitable. When I read the daily in the 5 places, verse 11, verse 12, verse 13, and then 11:31 and 12:11, at one level they always mean paganism, but each verse has its own subtle difference. So when we went to 11:31, which is I think where that discussion came up. Now I've been looking at 11:31 and I may well be wrong on 11:31. So if we read 11:31. Then who's next?
An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate.
So, verse 12, chapter 8, I'm understanding that to be (508) when Clovis, so 8:12 is Clovis in 508 fights against Visigoths. Then the papacy is allowed to be placed, begin to rule between 538 and 1798, where it practices and prospers. So that's how I'm understanding verse 12, and then in 11:31. This is how I'm understanding 11:31. I'm splitting it up into 4 parts. And I'm seeing 3 discrete histories. So I'm seeing that an army is given to the papacy. I don't know Hebrew well enough, so I don't know how to do this, but it says arms in the plural. And so I have to take that at its face value, that it's the plurality of an army, it's not a singular army. Whereas in 8 verse 12, it says it in the singular, it says a host. So one of the things that, rightly or wrongly, that I'm saying this is in the singular and this is in the plural.
Why is a host singular?
It's a singular entity.
Hosts would now be a word, right?
Yeah, those three hosts met together in battle.
Those three hosts. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
So I'm just seeing when it says a host as an army in a singular, or a nation or a people. I think you'd see, if you went into the definition of it, it wouldn't have it. I don't know how. When you go into the Hebrew, you know it's plural. It's obvious how, if you're a scholar, to do that, but I can't find that. There's no way I can. You can't go into a Hebrew Old Testament and look at all of those little characters, and I can't figure out if it's plural or not. So I'm taking that at face value, that when it says armies, it is in the plural. There's more than one army. So that's one point that I've picked up in verse 31, 31. Sorry, and then in the next part it says and they. So it continues this thought that it's a plurality of. So I'm going to put an army is given to the papacy, and they. So they're going to do three things. They're going to pollute the sanctuary. They're going to take away the daily, and they're going to place the abomination of desolation. So three things are done for the papacy. So I'm seeing the pollution of the sanctuary as being the year 330 AD, which I think is connected to Daniel 8:11. And this is pagan Rome.
Revelation 13:2.
Constantine, yes, and
321. I thought we marked.
sorry.
I thought we had marked this 321.
321. There's a cause and effect relationship. There's a Sunday law, but when he makes a Sunday law, he's not polluting Rome. The pollution of Rome, I've understood it that he basically says, I don't like living here anymore. This place isn't nice. So I want to move to a better place. So that's how I'm understanding this pollution of the sanctuary. He's casting it away because it's of no value to him. And this is Revelation 13, verse 2. So this is Constantine. So that's one army or one nation that has done something for it. Did you have a question, Brother Jonathan? No,
just a German question. What abomination of desolation is the German translation?
Okay. And then the second thing it does, it says it will take away the daily sacrifice. So here we have to understand what this take away is. And this is Sir, which is that imagery that it's rubbish that's going to be thrown away. So if you're going to Sir something, you're going to get rid of it. So you're fighting or warring against this thing. And so I'm understanding this to be 508, which is 12 verse 11 and 8 verse 12. And this is Clovis when he takes away the daily. So 1131 and 1211 are saying, with respect to this history, saying the same thing. And then the last part, this third part, it says, and they, again it talks about in the plurality, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So I'm understanding this to be 538, and there's we could put Daniel 12:11 here, and I'm understanding this to be pagan Rome, and this is Justinian. Where they take the third horn down.
It wasn't 533, right?
Yes, 533 is only 5 years before this. 533, 533, Justinian is going to make the papacy, the corrector of heretics. He's given him religious authority. He's given him power. But what marks the placing of the abomination of desolation is the fact that the last and third horn is taken away. So one thing that came up in class a while ago while I was away was in 8:12 it says transgression, and here it says abomination. And we know they're talking about the same power, so why is it changed names? No one's looking at me.
What was the question?
In 8:12 it says it's the transgression of desolation, and here it's called the abomination of desolation.
This is a church.
Didn't it transfer at 31
Cause to
AD?
effect, can you do that?
It came up, it was only about a week ago it came up.
Yeah,
Right,
but I
right.
don't know the answer.
Okay. So, sorry?
I'm afraid to throw it out there, it might be wrong, go ahead.
So this showing the church and state relationship.
It was the image of the beast and the other was the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
means what's that? I remember, but that doesn't answer the question.
Yeah.
Oh.
This is the image of the beast, and this is the mark of the beast. So this is showing the church-state relationship leading to the Sunday law. Yeah. So it's showing how you get to.
That was right. It was cause and effect.
Did you say that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say it. It's a cause and effect relationship. That's exactly what I was just going to say now. This is the cause and this is the effect. It shows you this transition from what happens when you do this to where you'll end up. So I think that's how it was. That's how it was brought up in class last
So
week.
you put 496 with Clovis for the image of the beast, and 538 when Justinian places him on the throne for the abomination to make it desolate. That's what you're saying.
538 and 496. So when we talk about that, we're talking about, yes, in the verse, in a specific verse, it'd be 496. They become one. But when I looked at verse 12, my focus was on 538, which is because that's where he says he's going to go against.
No, 5.
Sorry, 508, because he's going to war against the daily. But the transgression of desolation, which we didn't talk about when we spoke about this, is the church-state relationship, which happens in 496, from 493 to 496.
I'm going to say, could that be
Which bit when you put it?
transgression and abomination?
Yeah.
So transgression, abomination is worse than transgression. Abomination is a worse thing. Is that what?
I'm not trying to say it's worse. I'm trying to say once you do this, this is where it leads to. It's once you get into a relationship with the church and the state, it will always lead to persecution.
Okay.
So I don't know if I'd say one is worse than the other. It's when as soon as you go down the wrong path, you're going to end up in a wrong place.
No, I just remember when you was talking about Daniel 2 the last time you was here. You said the clay goes from bad to worse.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to connect the dots there. Whether he was thinking on that same page, on that same line before.
Perhaps.
When Sister White describes the difference between the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, you can plug it right in there. The image is representing how the beast functions, and it functions in a church-state relationship. That's the image of the beast. The mark of the beast is the sign of its authority, the Sunday law. So you can plug all of that information about the relationship between the image of the beast and the mark of the beast right in there. But have you ever noticed that there's 42 years span there, which is a number that identifies 1260? It's kind of like symbolizing something about Rome.
Where's the 42? Between
Let's do that.
496 to 538.
538, 496, 42. I never noticed that.
42 months.
Can you say again what that means?
This is the 1260.
Chapters.
The title of the chapter.
Yeah, in Thai. So that's what I'm saying about verse 12 and verse 31. So the main reason we went to verse 12 was to pick up this transgression. That is the definition when you go into the feet and toes of Daniel 2. That clay is in transgression, is in a relationship with the iron. I don't know how people read it, but in the English, it's in the King James, it's difficult. In verse 12, it says by reason of transgression. So I always struggle on how to actually make that into plain English to actually break down those words. But
I have a question.
yeah,
When you're looking at verse 30 and 31,
which
when does
11?
11? Where's the transition? It starts out in verse 30 with the ships of Chittim, which I've understood to be the second trumpet. Am I incorrect in that understanding? And
Yeah.
if it's a trumpet, if it's a second trumpet, then the king of the north, him or he, would be pagan Rome. What section of these verses transitions from the subject being pagan to papal? Do you know what part of the verse it transitions? Because he's going to have indignation against the Holy Covenant. I think that Uriah Smith applies that as the papacy.
No, I think Uriah Smith applies that to a warfare against the Bible that took place before the papacy.
Oh, okay.
But you can check that out. And the intelligence,
With them that forsake the Holy Covenant.
there's your falling away first.
There it is. Okay. All right. I see. Okay, so the reason I wanted to say that then is that if you get to this point that pagan Rome's having intelligence with the corrupt, apostatized early church, and then if you read in verse 31, an arm shall stand on, is it the papacy, or is it shall stand out of or from pagan Rome, and pagan Rome shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and take away the daily, and set up the abomination that maketh desolate? Who sets up the abomination that maketh desolate?
Pagan Rome.
Yeah, so my point is that when you see stand on his part, that phrase on his part can mean from out of. So I was wondering if the his is the papacy, or the abomination that maketh desolate is the papacy, and this is the transition.
Could you say that again? Because I think I'm
If
getting lost.
I was just struggling to understand. The papacy doesn't exist until the abomination that maketh desolate is set up in 538. So to have arms or armies standing on the papacy side doesn't really make sense until the papacy is an entity that exists.
No way. The arms stand up before. It's a regular subject.
No, yeah. The arms stand up before for the purpose of setting up that power. But I was just wondering that if these arms are standing on or from out of pagan Rome for the purpose of setting up the papacy.
Yeah.
Are you trying to connect the history of 30 to 31?
I'm just trying to understand the flow.
Because I see a break there. I see that when you get to verse 30, you're coming to the end of pagan Rome. You're at the second trumpet. Before people actually even understand what the issue, what the question is. Daniel 11 verse 30 and verse 31. There's a break that's made there. Maybe we should read verse 30. I don't know who's next to read. Read verse 30, then verse 31.
For the ships of Shittim shall come against him, therefore shall he be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant.
And 31.
And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate.
So verse 30 talks about the ships of Chittim, which are, we understand, are the Vandals, second trumpet. They're going to come against pagan Rome. Therefore he shall be grieved and return. So Justinian sends his general Belisarius, I think that's how you pronounce it, to make war against the Vandals in North Africa. He succeeds in that mission and he comes back. And when he comes back, from my understanding of that history, there's this issue that's going on in Constantinople. There's a religious struggle going on between the Pope in Rome, if we want to call him a Pope or a Bishop in Constantinople, of who's actually going to be the leader of the church. And then Justinian makes a decree, makes a ruling that he's going to give religious authority to the papacy, the Pope in Rome, and he does that in 533. Is that how you understand that verse?
That here that it says, he shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. Is that what you're saying?
No,
Yes.
no, he's
Oh.
not there
Oh,
yet.
you're not there.
He's saying that when they have indignation against
Oh,
the
yeah.
Holy Covenant, that is Justinian entering into the religious realm and identifying the Pope of Rome as the head of the churches.
So the rest of the verse, I'm not sure exactly when it says, and he shall have intelligence. I've understood that intelligence that he's having this communication with the papacy, who are the ones that forsake them, who are the ones that forsake the Holy Covenant. So the ones who forsake the Holy Covenant are the ones he's having intelligence with, which is the papacy. I don't know if that makes sense.
When's he having that intelligence? This is what Michael's after. If you got 533 in the second phrase and 4 phrases in the verse, then what's the third phrase and what's the date for the intelligence?
Or is it generally?
I just understood it as 533. I've not even thought about it that it's even more than that.
Okay, so why in the middle of 533, the second and fourth phrase you're saying are 533, and in the middle, what's the returning there?
We shall even return.
So see, there's 2 returnings in there, and Uriah Smith addresses them, and I don't remember how, but he mentions both of them. Do you?
No, I don't remember.
The word intelligence is actually to separate mentally or distinguish, to understand. The same thing that Daniel has to do with the vision.
What word?
Intelligence.
Intelligence, the word being to separate mentally or distinguish, to generally to understand. And then you have the extra words afterwards, like you said, that puts to have intelligence.
I see what you're saying. That now you're in the year 533 and you go back and it shows you the rise of this papacy and all the rest.
Yeah.
This is showing you its rise where it's communicating or having intelligence with the secular government. They're coming into line with each other and then break, and then it's showing you again history.
But since you brought verse 30 up, I think Elder Jeff is saying, what does actually verse 30 mean? And I'm saying I don't fully understand it. All I know is that it's dealing with the warfare against the Vandals, the success of that campaign, and then when he comes back, he's dealing with basically the church is disintegrating, and he needs to make a decision of who he's going to side with, and he does that in 533. And I've not looked at this verse in detail enough to see what the 2 returns are or any other piece of information on that. So I'll have to re-look at that.
My question still is, so,
Yeah.
so then the arm shall stand on his. This is the first time then you see the his applying to the papacy. But if you read it, that arms come from out of or stand in the place of pagan Rome for the purpose of setting up the papacy. I was just wondering, is that incorrect? Because now then, once you have the abomination that maketh desolate, the subject, as you follow through, now that's the subject. We know that's the subject of the rest of the chapter, and even in Daniel 12.
So that's where I got lost. Are you suggesting in verse 31, the subject, the his, it might be pagan Rome?
Yes. The ships of Shittim shall come against pagan Rome.
No, verse 31.
Oh, in verse 31.
The his. Who's the his?
I was suggesting that, is it possible?
That it be pagan Rome.
Yeah. It's pagan Rome setting up the papacy.
So arms, which is pagan Rome, or nations. So some nations are going to stand.
Not for. This is my question. On his part can mean from out of. So armies shall stand from out of pagan Rome, or for another power. You see the.
I'll have to look at verse 31.
I don't think you have to. It's his part. It's the papacy. But look at it so you can minimize it.
I think you need to look at verse 32 because
Connected.
Belisarius, he went to Africa after, returned from Africa 34 and not 33. 534.
Oh, you got 34.
He returned from his war against the Vandals.
Okay.
534. 35.
That's the first return in the verse?
Yeah.
So that disannuls 533 because it comes after. That's what you're saying?
No, the first return, the second return is when, after which he has intelligence, right?
Before.
Before he has intelligence, yes. And Parminder said that this was his return from the wars against the Vandals. The wars against the Vandals were 533 to 534.
So in verse 30, it says, therefore he shall be grieved and return. You're marking that as?
I don't know where to mark this.
Oh, I thought you were...
I just say it cannot be the return from the Vandal wars.
Okay.
Because they were after the decree of Justinian.
So the second return, in verse 13, and have indignation against the Holy Covenant, so shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. So that second return, so we don't even know what the second return is then. At least I don't.
It's not the same, but just giving another view on this, the reason of his return. That's one.
It's so shall he do, he shall even return.
He shall even return.
I thought, that's what I originally thought it was one return, but I'm even getting all the dates out of sync now on this. So I think I'm going to have to go back and
Sorry, I totally sidetracked.
have a look at that.
Well,
Verse 31.
31, we just discussed it, that, and the arms shall stand on his part, and the arms, it's Clovis in 496. So that's also back. It's on the board.
I think that's what I'm saying. I'm thinking. I don't think it's saying that. That I'm giving 3 dates here. 1, 2, 3, rightly or wrongly.
And then he's saying that the arms is, in a general sense, the army standing for the papacy. And I was saying, could you read it that it's the arms standing from pagan Rome? And it's based on the phrase "on his part." Is it from pagan Rome or for the papacy?
Doesn't sound right when you read it. An arm shall stand on your own part.
No, not on your own part. On.
But it is if
From
it's
out
from.
of-
It
from out
doesn't
of.
sound right. Arm shall stand on for yourself. You stand up for yourself.
I was just wondering because I didn't know what the expression "on his part" meant. And when you look it up, it sounds like it can mean from out of. Or I mean, that's the direct meaning of it.
The reason why I think 31 is the papacy, when it says arms shall stand on his part, then it says 3 things. And they, the armies, are going to pollute the sanctuary of strength and I always put in for him. They shall take away the daily sacrifice for him, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate, and that abomination desolate is the him. So,
No, yeah.
I'll look at it. So that's why I think the his is papacy, and it's gone back in. It's gone back to see how the papacy is going to rise, in the same way that verse 30 tells you, pagan Rome's coming down, papacy is coming up, and it tells you how he rises when he does that.
Without doing what I'm going to suggest, and this is a minor thing, but from verse 30 to the beginning to the end of verse 31, you can put the waymarks of 9/11 to the Sunday law, and if you do that, in order to make those waymarks line up, the returns would be the doubling of the second angel's message, so they would be the same return. I'm just saying that
Okay.
the prophetic level, I would be looking for it being just a repeat and enlargement. Because the ships of Chittim is at 9/11, the placing of the abomination of desolation is a Sunday law, and you can fit it all in there at that level. So I would think it's the same return, but you'd have a later history.
Okay. So that would mean it would be 534?
I don't know about that part.
Okay.
I'm just saying that the double return is a doubling.
Is that what you're saying, Brother Marco? It'd have to be 534? Because that's when he would return.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I got confused, because I don't know if we can accurately place. Well, we say it all the time that the religious authority is given in 533. So either it's dealing with the religious authority is given by Justinian. I don't know. I don't know what that return means then. I always assumed the return was the return from the war. And maybe I haven't paid enough careful attention to say he returns from the war. In fact, he doesn't even go to the war, it's his general. His general's returning in 34, and he's given authority in 33. And those two things are not working.
But you say that the war that he went on, he was victorious.
Yeah.
But the verse says when he returns, he's grieved.
Yeah.
Why would you be grieved if you're victorious?
That's why I need to go back, because I need to go recheck the history and see what's going on here, because I thought he was grieved because when he comes back, his capital, his empire is in a mess, and he needs to sort this out. He thought he'd come back, everything was all okay, and now things are just getting from bad to worse. That's how I understood that grieving.
He cannot rescue the empire, even
Yes.
through this big victories, reconquering all the north of Africa. The empire is crumbling.
Because what appears to be a political issue is turning out actually to be a religious issue, and everything's slipping out of his hands. So, before we close, let's just summarise what we looked at today. It was just a continuation that the clay in Daniel 2 is mixing with the state. And I'm not trying to make any play to identify who that clay is, whether it's Protestantism or the Seventh-day Adventist Church or Catholicism at this level. All I'm saying is that clay is mixing with the state, and a clay is a representation of a church. So I'm not saying what church it is at this level, because we don't need to. All we know that it's mixing with the state, and when it's mixing with the state, it must be in a situation or a condition that it's doing something that's wrong, that it's in transgression, which brought us down to 8:12, and you see that it's in transgression there, where the papacy is transgressing with Clovis. And then we just tidied up, hopefully, what 8:12 is, the history behind that. And I'm suggesting that it's the same history of 1211, that Clovis is going to fight against the papacy in order to bring down the Visigoths, so that in the second part of the verse he can begin to practice and prosper. Then we looked at 1131 and I don't know if everybody's agreeing, but that's how I'm reading verse 31. A plurality of armies are given to the papacy in a general sense, and then it's three histories that come up. 330, 508, 538. So the pollution of the sanctuary is Constantine in 330 AD. The taking away of the daily is 508, and it's Clovis that's doing that. And if we're going to put Clovis in here, we know that Clovis has this interaction in 496, which is the history back here in Daniel 8:12, because in this little rephrasing of the verse, I didn't put the transgression bit in it. As soon as you put the transgression piece, you put the date 496. So you've got 330 and 496, which is connected to 508, and then you have the placing of the abomination of desolation, which is 538. And if you were to use this date, anyway, let me think through a bit more on that. So that's what we got through. And then we looked at verse 30 and 31, where you see pagan Rome coming to its end, coming up to 538, and the papacy, how it rises, which is verse 31, which was spoken. It's the rise of the papacy from 330 to 538. And I don't know the history well enough in verse 30 to make any kind of good explanation of what those things are talking about. So I'm going to try and look at that for tomorrow's class, and everybody else should be doing the same. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. Father, we stand before you at the end of the world, and we realise that even though we've been studying these things for many years, it's so easy to forget these important points. And often, Father, we find that we haven't even forgotten these things, but we've never even looked at them properly. It's so easy for us, Lord, to make assumptions, to gloss over words and only cherry pick certain thoughts and ideas. But more and more, Father, I'm finding that every time I've done that I've missed vital pieces of information that are needed to be built upon when new truths are coming to view. Father, may each of us be determined to try and study things through in a systematic and an organised way, so that we don't bypass important pieces of information that we may need for the future. Father, be with us and bless us for this day. We ask and pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.